And welcome everybody to week 4, session 4 with Penny on teaching and researching. Take it away, Penny.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, just I've made a slight alteration to the curriculum. If you go in and look at the names of the sessions, the last 2 sessions, which we've got coming up after this one, we have a couple of topics. One is teacher research done by teachers, and the other is what can the research tell us to help us plan a syllabus. And I want to spread out the teacher research thing over 2 weeks in order to give people time to prepare and do it when it's convenient to them. So we'll be mixing those 2 topics over the next 2 weeks. Okay, so it's just to let you know, it's written there on the curriculum. And the other preliminary thing is the survey, which I asked you to do, and which several of you have sent me results, and I actually managed about 3 hours ago, I managed to collate them into a table. Let's see if I can share it, and then you can see it's a Word document. Can you see that?
Yes.
So I'll scroll down, and first of all, we'll just look and see, and I won't read it out, obviously, but if you have any comments on any of them, please feel free to comment. We've got, just trying to move my thing so I can see the, okay. So here,
I think Michelle had her hand up.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify that the NA doesn't mean, it means nobody selected recast. It doesn't mean that nobody answered, right? It just, I just wanted to make sure that anybody reading that interpreted that as
applicable. Did you ask them?
Oh, okay. Yes, the complete poll was given, but there were several
so this would be
questions
a 0.
that nobody.
Should be a 0?
Yeah, 0 is probably more accurate.
Okay, 0 out of 13. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. So what we're seeing here basically is that recast is probably the least popular, and a lot of people like the teacher to actually provide the correct answer, or to be elicited from the student. It's sort of not a clear majority either way, right? If I'm reading the numbers clearly. Any comment on that? But anyway, they like a proper correction. They don't like a quick skimpy recast. They want you to spend time looking at and correcting properly. Who do you like to correct, your teacher or classmate? You get a very clear answer. And it was the same as the survey which I did with my students. But the vast majority, not unanimous, incidentally, but the vast majority prefer the teacher to give the response. And remember, we talked about it last time and came to the conclusion that, or I came to the conclusion after talking to my teachers, that the reason is mainly that they simply rely on the teacher to give a better quality of feedback than they do on each other. What helps most for Maria, incidentally, I rounded off your numbers, okay, but they represent, I think, fairly clearly the percentages that you gave me. And here, just looking at the results here. Interesting that in Maria's, the very clear of the biggest single group was saying that they like the teacher actually to say to write in the correct form.
They don't like this coding. This is time consuming. They believe it's time consuming and they
Yeah.
don't like this underlining and
Yours
coding, but I
didn't
do
like the-
this,
Didn't like the
but I
coding.
do this.
Yeah. Yeah, in spite of the fact they don't like it. Yeah, well, you have your own preferences as well.
Don't we think like students would need a kind of guide? I mean, if we give them a handout, for example, like SP means spelling or WC means word choice, if that's clear and you can teach them to use that, then I think
Yeah.
that's efficient.
It might just be
Yeah.
that they're not used to it. Maria.
They know what they stand for, but anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, for whatever reason. Yeah. Yeah. But it's interesting, the very high proportion of learners who like the teacher actually to write in the correct form. And I don't think this is laziness. I think this is a genuine feeling that it really helps me if the teacher tells me what the right form is, and then I can work on it and move on rather than worrying about whether I've got it right or not. So that's an interesting finding there. Sorry. Let's go back. Where were we? Make it speaking. When do you prefer to get the correction immediate, delayed? And here, again, there seems to be, our group was different actually, funnily enough, of us, 3 out of the 5 preferred delayed. But of the, sorry, I'm missing Maria's input here. But of Michelle and Maria's respondents, there's fairly clear preference for immediate. And also, as we saw, the research indicates that immediate tends to be more effective in terms of uptake. Does it help if the teacher reminds you of the rule? Yep. People seem to like that, not just us, but Maria and Michelle's respondents as well. So rules are a good thing. Does it help to write it out again correctly? And again, most of the students seem to realize that it does, and it's not, you know, one would expect perhaps that they'd prefer not to because it takes time and it's tedious and it's a lot of work, but they do seem to be aware that it really helps them learn. And here we've got a sort of consistent answer all along. Grammarly, our group was fairly skeptical, but the others, sorry, I should have taken care to keep that on the same page. The other groups, let's do that now so that it can be clearer. Okay. Right. So we said not sure or not very useful. And Michelle's friends and colleagues had the same opinion, but Maria's and Michelle's less advanced students were quite keen on it. See the results there of Maria's, sort of 90%, more than 90% said they found it useful. And Michelle's also 10 out of 13 found it useful. Any comments on that?
That
Or on
means
any
they know
of
how
us?
to use the tools.
Is it a problem? And Grammarly is fairly straightforward, no?
Mm.
Well, for them,
Michelle? Sorry.
Speaking about knowing how to use the tools, when I provided them with a poll, they whipped out their phones, almost 100% of them whipped out their phones, and they all had apps on it that translated the poll automatically. Now, I had no way of being able to see how accurate their translations were, but it really made me rethink how I have to select, have a different approach towards reading because my idea of what they needed in order to survive with reading skills
Yeah.
may be very different from reality, how they are actually coping with the settlement process. Anyway,
So you think they're using translating tools, Google Translate and things like that much more?
Oh,
Mhm.
and incredibly efficiently. I mean, I know at the very beginning of the semester, they had very little vocabulary and their communication with me was often through these translators. So I had first-hand experience using them to communicate with the learners. And what I noted was there was a range. Some of these were excellent. Like I could not believe how accurate they were. Others were
Yeah,
not very
I think
accurate. And so you didn't even
the
have equity
latest
within the group.
generation of the translation tools of Google are so much better than they were a year or two ago.
And so we
this-
have to rethink what do they
We have to
actually need,
rethink,
or
absolutely.
we have to talk to them about what they actually need in terms of language acquisition, because it's probably quite different from, what it would have been before the translators were
Yeah,
commonly used.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And this is the food for thought for the teacher, to be careful before getting ready with the test, what test to choose and the way to do it. When they
Yeah.
use digital resource, I mean, when they do the task digitally, they can easily check all these tools and write the tests correctly very quickly, and it doesn't take
Yeah.
them much time to do. That's why before doing that, before getting ready for the test, you have to rethink how to design the test.
Are
and
many
what
of
to
them
do.
using GPT, ChatGPT or Bard or any of the
Yeah,
others?
many of them. Mhm.
And I think it goes even further than how do we make sure that our tests are reliable, that as in we have to think about, well, language use is different now. And so we have to I think we have to think about what our curriculum is and what do learners actually need now, and what should we be shifting our way of not just assessment, but shifting our way of teaching as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. I think this will sort itself out as the dust settles, but at the moment the dust has not yet settled. We're still in the
I
middle
don't
of
think
the
it's going to
sandstorm.
settle. It's going to keep on
Yeah.
in the storm for a while.
Anyway, so
I started
interesting
using,
insights came
excuse
from that.
me.
Sorry,
Mhm.
yes, Maria.
I started using photocopier for tests, and I don't let them use their phones. I ask the students to put away their phones while doing the test.
Yes, yes.
So because of being aware that they cheat.
Right, and a lot of universities now are not allowing students to do tasks online, only pencil and paper in the presence of the teacher, and that is one thing. Another thing which I saw someone suggest on the internet was writing assignments that are very personalized. In other words, they have to talk about themselves in some way which nobody else can do. So that's another helpful tip, I think. Anyway, let's move on to the topic of this week, which was grammar. And I want to share the screen for this week. And I started off with, I decided to start off with something neat and lighter. So we're starting off with a slightly fun thing, which I've called a prelude. Which is, the question is whether English grammar is actually changing. And there's been some research done on what's called diachronic corpora, a corpus which tags all its entries over time. So you can see when and what year each entry came in. And you can see if there have been, over the last 30, 40 years, the last generation or two, if there have been significant changes in English grammar. And I came across this, I attended a seminar in Russia about 8 or 9 years ago, and I came across a researcher called Bas Alts, who is, I think, from Holland, and he opened my eyes to this, and I'm using his work mainly as a basis. And here are the things which he tells us, okay? So, one, decline of the use of must. Mainly must for obligation mainly, and tendency to be replaced by have to. So must is used much less. Decline the use of shall. I was taught as a child with the first person, you should say shall, I shall, we shall. And with the second and third person, you should say will. Well, forget it. It's all will today. I will, we will, even in formal writing. And the third interesting one is the increased use of the present progressive, including so-called stative verbs. You know, it's not just McDonald's, I'm loving it, right? Maybe that's where it started. But it's there's a lot, and I'll show you some other evidence in a second.
In
I don't know
films
how
as
many-
well.
Sorry?
In films, you can also hear a lot saying, I wanting,
right.
I'm liking. Mhm.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it chimes with our intuitions. I don't know if you know this website, this tool, online tool, it's a really nice one. It also looks at the frequency of words or phrases over time. Okay, so that it gives you a timeline of how words are used, and they're basing it on books that were published up to 2019, probably update as time goes on. But at the moment, it's from 1800 up to 2019. You can see how usages have changed. So I looked at these things and did screenshots of the results to show you. So this is, can't read it. What does it say? Must versus have to.
Oh, yeah.
I've got, I'm not using my own computer today, so it's must versus have to. So you've got must, the blue line, declining, have to slightly increasing, but the must decline is very clear. Okay. And the next one, I hope I can read this one. The use of shall, also a clear decline. Fairly consistent over the last sort of 100, 200 years, gradually declining, and will taking its place. And I gave a few examples of present progressive used with stative verbs. So this one, again, I need to look at it more closely. Are you wanting? Okay. Now, are you wanting? It's not a gradual change. It's definitely a 21st century change, or a 20th, 21st century change. Look at that steep rise at the end there. Okay, so it's do you want consistently over previous generations, and suddenly today we're getting are you wanting? And here's another example, if I can read this one, what I said here. Are you understanding? Using the understanding again. This is slightly less steep over the last few years, but it's also a clear rise. And the next one, I am liking. And here you get this steep rise over the last few years. It's interesting, isn't it? And as Maria says, you hear it in movies. You hear it also in people's informal speech. Yeah. Okay. Any comments on that? I
Yeah,
don't know if that makes much difference to our teaching, but I think it's something that we need to be aware of.
Yeah.
Steve, you wanted to say something?
No, just
Students
that
ask
it's all
questions.
very interesting, very interesting.
Yes, yeah, I thought you'd like that as a sort of starter for this week's sessions. Okay, let's go. Yeah, Michelle.
Can I just ask if this is more vocabulary based, but did they, even though there's the grammar link, but did they mention anything about sentence length or use of verb tenses? You can't really search for those things, can you? You have to search for particular phrases. So we couldn't, for example, with a
how they did it, whether they did it using the asterisk. So if you say is and then asterisk ing, it'll give you any is doing, is going, and they look at, I think they just manually counted the number of so-called stative verbs, or the number of present progressive instances, which obviously is on the rise. One thing which Artsbas mentions in his article is that on the whole, present progressive is more common in American English than it is in British English. And one of the reasons for its rise is the influence of American English on British English.
Yeah, okay.
But anyway,
Thanks.
okay, let's move on. Okay, explicit. Yes, Hugh, you want to say something?
Well, I was just laughing, remembering I was with some friends in a pub a few nights ago, and there was a music video on the TV, and my friends were asking me, so who are these musicians? Do you know them? And I said, no, I don't know who they are, but I think they're Australians. But they're singing pop songs with very American accents. And I was just thinking, you know, the dominance of American pop music, of rock and roll, means the standard for pop music, no matter the origin of the singer, is mostly very American.
Yeah. You see it in the Eurovision Song Contest, right? A lot of the singers singing in English, but it tends to be American English.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was just fascinated, and there was something about the body language, style of dress, presentation that made me feel very strongly that they were Australian, and then turned out that I was
that
right.
you are right.
Yeah.
Globalization. it is
Well,
called.
Americanization.
And very
Americanization.
simplified.
Up to a point.
Simplification. Mhm.
Okay, explicit or implicit grammar teaching. I mean, I won't only talk about explicit and implicit. This is a very, very basic, fundamental distinction in the controversy over how best to teach grammar, or if to teach grammar at all. So just to define these terms, okay, so we have implicit knowledge and implicit teaching. Implicit knowledge is the kind of knowledge that you have, sort of gut knowledge. You know how to do something without necessarily knowing how to explain it. Like you know how to ride a bicycle, but you couldn't explain how to ride a bicycle, or a native speaker knows how to speak their own language without knowing how to articulate the grammar rules. Implicit teaching, therefore, means without any explanation or focus practice or anything, just exposing learners to the language and letting them pick up the grammar, or pick up whatever skill it is. And I've listed a few other skills for which this is also true at the bottom in my notes there. They just pick it up, as it were, by the seat of their pants as they go. Explicit, on the other hand, is knowing something. It includes implicit, and so you know something, but you also, crucially, are able to describe or define it in words. So, for example, defining grammatical rules, not just observing them in your own output, but also being able to define. And explicit teaching means actually explaining target behavior skill and requiring application of rules. So, for example, explaining grammatical rules. Our target, I think we have to bear in mind, what we want our students to achieve is the implicit. We might use the explicit as a way in, but what our ideal is a student who can, without thinking, just produce acceptable grammar as they go on the wing, as it were. And that's what we want to achieve. And so the question is, can explicit teaching contribute to implicit knowledge? Okay, or as Krashen and others would have it, do you have to have implicit teaching in order to achieve what he calls acquisition or implicit knowledge of a language? So Ellis, I've given a particular reference there, but he in all his articles, or a lot of his articles, he refers to this. He has a division between what he calls strong interface, non-interface, and weak interface positions between explicit teaching and implicit knowledge. So the strong interface says explicit knowledge can transform into implicit through practice and proceduralization. In other words, it's a conventional idea that you teach a grammatical structure, you practice it, and gradually students get used to doing it right, and they learn to transform that rule into their own implicit knowledge and output. Non-interface is the exact opposite. It says, like Krashen, it's no use teaching rules. They'll never transform one into the other. If you want to achieve implicit knowledge, you have to teach it through lots of comprehensible input. And the weak interface, which Ellis is actually in favor of, says that you want to achieve implicit knowledge, and you'll mostly do it through exposure to input, but explicit knowledge can facilitate and accelerate the learning of this kind of implicit knowledge. So the underlying research which influenced Ellis and others in their theories was Pieneman's teachability hypothesis. How many of you know about this? No? Hugh?
I
Yes.
think, yes, a long
Yes.
time ago.
Okay, let me remind you.
Fuzzy memory, but
Okay, when I tell you, well, you can see it, it says here on the screen, and you know, I'm sure you're saying in your mind, oh yes, now I remember. The hypothesis suggests, and he based his research on German, the learning of German, but afterwards tried out also in English, and apparently it applies also to English, that there is a set order in which students learn grammatical structures when they're learning English or any language. And there's nothing you can do about this. It's built into our language learning system. And therefore, he says this order is impermeable to teaching. If you teach an advanced structure before a student has mastered the earlier ones, it won't help because they're not ready for it. They won't learn it. And he even goes so far as to say, and I read his article, and it is indeed what he said. I reminded myself this morning, looked at the article again. Teaching a structured learner is not ready for, he says, may be detrimental to learning. It may actually do harm. Not only doesn't it help, but it might harm. So the consensus is, after lots of follow-up research studies and criticism, the bottom line is that most people today would accept, at least perhaps not a very strong version, but a version of Pieneman's hypothesis. In other words, it seems fairly well established that there is some kind of natural order of acquisition, and that this needs to be taken into account when we are teaching. So it doesn't make sense, in other words, to impose our own syllabus on a class or on a student if we're teaching one-to-one, because this may not fit the natural developmental order. So what's the various conclusions of this? One conclusion would be teach structures, therefore, according to the developmental order. But we don't have a complete list anywhere, as far as I know, of the developmental order of structures in English, although there are partial ones, but the complete one is not altogether clear. It's very time consuming to determine at what stage a learner is. What are you going to do? You're going to take all the learners in your class and check for each one what stage they're at, which you can do. Okay, you can listen to them speak and note down what they know and what they don't know, but it's time consuming. And in any case, if you're teaching a class of more than 2, your learners are all going to be at different stages. So it's no use saying, I'm going to teach this structure tomorrow if half your class are not there yet and half your class are there. Maybe there's 1 or 2 who are well beyond it. So conclusion 1 doesn't really work very well in practical terms. Conclusion 2, and some people have drawn this conclusion, don't try to teach grammar at all. It's no use explaining and doing intensive practice because they aren't, if they're not ready, they're not going to pick it up. And if they are ready, they're going to pick it up anyway. So don't bother, just lots and lots of comprehensible input. But Pieneman himself in his article says, I don't accept this conclusion because experience shows that if you don't teach students grammar, at least in a foreign language, in an instructional situation, if you don't teach them, they very often learn wrong or unacceptable forms, and these in fact fossilize over time, however many times they are exposed to the correct forms. And he says, I don't accept this because I think you do need to teach grammar, but the question is how, if the developmental order is in fact true. Ellis comes up with the following solution. He says in his article, Practice or Consciousness Raising, he says there's no way you can teach grammar exactly at the right point for every single student in your class. But if you do some kind of explicit teaching of a rule, conscious teaching of a rule, which he calls consciousness raising, making students aware what the rule is and how it works. Very often he does this through inductive exercise. We'll be talking about inductive and deductive a bit later. And he calls this consciousness raising. And he says that if you raise students' consciousness of a particular rule, even if they are not ready at that point, the consciousness raising, the fact that they've learned the rule, will enable them to notice the actual structure when it comes up in input much better than if they had not had the initial consciousness raising. And he also says that practice as such doesn't help very much, and consciousness raising does. But then the question comes up, another piece of research here, does it really hurt to teach ahead of a learner's present stage? Remember, Pieneman said, don't teach ahead of the student, it can actually be detrimental to learning. And Spada and Loutboin in their research, 1999, they looked at question forms, and they did check the group of students as to what stage they were at, and some of them were at an earlier stage of question forms. Say, the earliest stage would be just a statement of the rising inflection, and then inversion like, are you going instead of you are going. And then the third stage would be the introduction of an auxiliary do or did or does. So do you go, or does he like it? And then the next stage would be a WH question with inversion, and so on up the line. So you get the idea. And they found that their students were at all sorts of different levels. And they didn't actually do conscious teaching or exercise. They did a lot of very focused exposure and highlighting of the different question forms to the entire class. And what they found, and they tested them at the end after this intense exposure to lots and lots of question forms at all sorts of levels. And they tested them at the end. And they found that, as it says here, learners did indeed seem to follow the order. No, they didn't. They did not find that students had mastered a later form before they mastered an earlier form. But teaching them in advance didn't seem to hurt. Now, if you taught something, an more advanced form of the question, the interrogative form, even a student who was, say, 2 stages behind could benefit from it and learn from it, and all the students progressed. So it does not seem to be true that teaching ahead actually hurts. So conclusion 3, that there probably is, as I said before, a natural development or order of acquisition. This may be different for learners coming from a different L1. This is another point which actually Pieneman himself noted. but teaching the grammar can accelerate the process. There is value to explicit teaching of some kind or other, and this does not hurt, but can contribute. And I just want to add my own comment on this. When I was studying this this issue, two things that for my own teaching, these are the two things which I learned from me. First of all, stop worrying. If a student hasn't picked up a particular grammatical structure, it's not my fault. And it's not because the student's stupid. It may just be that they're not ready. And if I teach it in another month or two, they will be ready and they'll pick it up. And the second thing is that if students are developing at different rates, but they're developing along the same line, it makes sense to come back and review a structure that I taught 2 months ago, because today there will be students who are ready to take it on, which 2 months ago they weren't. And therefore you need to review, and you should not just do a linear, I don't think anybody would say this anyway, but teach a grammatical structure, say, right, I've taught that, that's behind us, let's move on, I'm not going to go back to it. I think that approach nobody would accept today. There is a point in coming back to it, which will lead us on to a principle called focus on form, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But now I'm going to pause and have a little bit of coffee, and one of you can say something, contribute to the discussion, say what you think about this.
Well, I'll jump in and say, I mean, my roots are in literature rather than applied linguistics, really. And it seems to me, for example, that if you're in a situation where you're exposed to challenging texts at a fairly young age, so when I was in a fairly high-level academic junior high school, we read lots of Shakespeare, we read the Aeneid, the Iliad, the Odyssey. We read lots and lots of things that were completely over our heads, of course. And I found it sometimes very difficult, but I quickly adopted a strategy, especially for Shakespeare. I took LPs out of the public library and listened to the plays being performed, and that helped me to understand the grammar and the flow and the rhetoric and so forth. And it seems to me that if we're doing, I think Ellis is correct in a sense, consciousness raising is a great thing, and that going back so that, I mean, what I'm trying to say is, of course, as a 14-year-old or whatever, you're not going to get Shakespeare, but if you reread over your lifetime, you're going to get better at understanding the vocabulary, the grammar, all the psychological and aesthetic dimensions of the literary text.
Yeah.
And I think our students could benefit from doing more reading aloud. I mean, some really traditional, old-fashioned kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about learning by heart, Hugh?
Oh, I think absolutely. Yeah. Reciting poetry or doing plays, performing plays, learning the lines by heart, probably really good practice.
Really good practice, and it stands you in good stead later for grammar, for vocabulary, for everything. Yeah. Michelle.
I have a hard time convincing my learners of that, though. I mean, the formulaic phrases and being able to just learn the few things that you need in order to be more functional will make your life easier and will help you with grammar and vocabulary. I find there's still resistance in this particular group. I haven't always found that with all of my learners, but there's a will to be independent, and I think they feel it's an insult to their creativity, to their intelligence, and they're extremely resistant to learning formulaic phrases, even at the early stage of language acquisition.
Yeah, not only.
And the other thing I was actually going to say was that it's a huge. I was just going
Sorry?
to say it's also a huge challenge teaching implicitly because people don't have time to do the kind of, let's say, extensive reading or extensive exposure to listening that you would. And I'm in a luxurious context. I would imagine it's even harder if you're teaching EFL. But I am finding it hard with even within my context with people's work commitments and family commitments and being in a community of people who speak their own language. Because we have a huge Ukrainian community in Manitoba where I live. And so people aren't getting exposure to a language broadly the way that you would
Yeah.
hope they would to support implicit learning.
Yeah. I think a lot of these researchers draw conclusions and have ideas about what the teacher should do, which don't take into account how much work they're making the teacher do, you know, like finding out what stages your students are at, or as Michelle says, creating the enormous amount of comprehensible input at the correct stage for them. All sorts of things which are really, really difficult for a teacher to do in a heavy schedule. I'll come back
But
to
it's
this
also the
later.
cost of it, right? Like how much time do you spend doing this if you're teaching? I only teach 2 evenings a week right now. I used to teach full time, but with 2 evenings a week, there's not much time to do everything that you know needs to be done.
Absolutely, yeah.
There is no ready-made recipe. It depends on every separate situation. That's it. And what I wanted to add is that learning by heart the sentences can work as substitution table for a different grammar, changing from tense to tense. If you learn one sentence by heart, you tell them then make a substitute with the different time expressions and make changes. That helps.
Yeah. Yeah, I think learning by heart is really, really helpful in all sorts of ways and all sorts of contexts, for vocabulary and for grammar and for general fluency. But I haven't actually included that in this course, but just note in passing that I completely agree with you on this point, Michelle and Maria.
And learning by
Okay.
heart and then writing,
And
checking on them
learning,
themselves.
speaking, writing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how many of you know the work of Carolyn Graham on jazz chants.
Oh, yeah.
It's also based on, she did a lot of work in Japan. I met her in Japan, in fact. And it's completely based on learning by heart, and it's very effective and as well as fun. Okay, so my bottom line here, in any case, it seems that explicit grammar teaching is likely to be useful in most instructional contexts, some measure of explicit grammar teaching. And two big surveys here, Norris and Ortega's very often quoted, who found an explicit advantage for explicit teaching. They've been criticized because a lot of their results were based on what students said they knew rather than their actual implicit output, sorry. Whereas the Spada and Tomita study 2010, 10 years later, also shows a clear advantage for explicit teaching, but they also looked at how students had benefited in terms of their own output and found that they were actually able to express themselves. The groups which had some explicit teaching were actually expressing themselves more fluently and accurately in their written and spoken output. So yes, some measure of explicit grammar teaching is okay, together with obviously a lot of communicative input and output. So you bottom line, you need both. And it's not an either or, right? I mean, there has been, I think there is in our field, there's a lamentable tendency to throw out babies with bathwater, saying this doesn't work and therefore let's throw it out completely and do something completely different. And to use another cliche, I think you can have your cake and eat it. I think you can do both. And if one thing doesn't work, don't throw it out, but look how you can make it work better by combining it with different strategies. So that's my piece of advice for today. Okay. So the question is, if we accept that, yes, explicit teaching helps, the question is when, where, how, what kind of explicit teaching? And there's been this controversy over focus on form versus focus on forms, which is very confusing. It started off with an article by Long and Robinson, 1998, contrasting between traditional grammar teaching, which is focus on forms, okay, the S is the traditional one, and reactive focus on form within a task-based syllabus. That means you come up against something within a communicative task or within a text you're reading of the class, and you say, wait, no, let's stop for a second, look at the grammar, and then go back to the communication. So that's focus on form. Originally unplanned, and what Long and Robinson said was, don't plan anything, but wait for it to come up. So it could be because the student made a mistake, or it could be something which is very salient or frequently comes up in a text, or it could be something a student notices and asks about. It could be all sorts of reasons, but it's reactive, and you improvise the answer. That was the ideal, but there are two problems with this. One is it puts an enormous amount of responsibility on the teacher. Okay, here I'm coming up against a mistake which a student has made, and I need to be able, on my feet, to improvise an explanation of what they did wrong and what the grammatical structure is, and the best way to convey it to the students without any preparation. So it's a bit hard on the teacher. I mentioned before that some of these, some researchers seem to demand quite a lot of a teacher. And second, there's no guarantee over time that you'll cover a reasonable range of grammatical structures, because you're dependent on what happens to come up in your particular tasks which you're working on. So over time, people have retained the idea of focus on form, but have accepted that sometimes, yes, you'll need to pre-plan it. So the textbooks might plan a response to grammatical structures that come up in a text. And there is some evidence in the Nassaji study, which I mentioned here, that if you have pre-planned focus and form, you actually get better teaching and learning. Other studies show no significant difference, and I'll come on to an allied perspective, which Spada and Lightbound did a lot of research on. When is focus on form likely to be more effective? If it's isolated or integrated? In other words, and they're using focus on form in a more general, with a more general significance here. Is it better if you take time out and say, okay, let's spend a few minutes just looking at this particular grammatical structure? Or is it better if it's integrated into the task and you simply pick up the grammatical structure, talk about it for a few minutes, and then go back into the task again? So it's integrated into the task. Which is better? And they asked teachers and students what they felt about whether integrated or isolated was better. Not that much difference in the most recent study, Valliere and Spada 2016. Most of the respondents said they preferred it integrated. They preferred to go into the grammar as it grew out of a task, but they acknowledged that there was also a place for isolated. In other words, here again, you're having your cake and eating it. I don't think there's any particular value in doing it one way or the other, but it's important to do both. Tentative conclusion then. You probably need both implicit and explicit. Teaching a linear grammatical syllabus, as was, for example, in the traditional grammar translation or audiolingual methodologies, teach this and then teach that and then teach that, and don't come back to them, just move on. that probably is not optimally effective. You do need a more recursive, cyclical, repetitive sequence. But either a linear grammatical syllabus backed up by reactive focus on form, which ensures your review later, or reactive focus on form backed up by occasional isolated focus on forms based on a grammatical syllabus. So I think either of those would work. It's not a question necessarily of having to choose either one or the other. Yeah, okay, pause, another gulp of coffee, and over to you. No? Is it clear? Does it make sense? Anything you'd like to disagree with or add to or suggest?
Well,
Here in Japan, we have students who've studied English grammar translation method for 6 to 10 years. And therefore, I wanted to start by saying it's complicated. It's very, very complicated because we could have 25 to 40 students in a class at almost 25 different levels, depending on how much they got from the grammar translation. You've also got a situation where the family members have failed at English for generations, and there's no expectation that anybody should be able to use English. And you have this kind of almost toxicity towards the word grammar. I in the high school in over 20 years, halfway through, I stopped using the word grammar. I said, the meaning is broken. I can't understand, we have a meaning broke down. And as long as I avoided the word grammar, then I still had them working with me. So I then went into sort of a fluency-based approach because they were so damaged by accuracy that they were, I've never found a better word than constipated. They had years and years of English in their brains, but could not get any of it out. So I had to kind of, as a reaction, say, we're here to communicate your ideas and your opinions. We don't care. This is not a grammar test right now. So just to get them inspired even a little bit goes a long way to them then engaging more with wanting to know when they make a mistake or daring to put their hand up to ask a question when they can't say what they want to say. So I've been sitting here going, oh my God, I could talk about this for hours with all of you, and especially those of you in Japan who have this. Yeah, so it's complicated is I guess the bottom line of what I want to say.
What about those of you who teach in Japan? What do you say about what Stephen's just said?
Oh, absolutely. I started teaching everybody from 5-year-olds to 70-year-olds, and especially with the younger children who I worked with for a number of years. They loved English. They looked forward to doing English in junior high school. And within 3 to 6 months after they started in junior high school, it seemed that they had learned to hate English, and that sometimes transferred into hatred to me. And it was so
because of the grammar focus,
because of the grammar
the
translation.
accuracy focus in general.
These were young people that I felt really close to. I bonded with them as, my students over 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and then they came to hate English, and it was so sad.
Wow, is that true even to today?
A little less so, I think, because the Ministry of Education has done this ALT program, so there are far more foreigners here now than there used to be, and so most students are not afraid of foreigners, and they have more communicative practice.
And also they're updating the textbooks, right? So that there is more conversation and less focus on grammar. But the teachers were educated under grammar translation. So I think many are having a hard time adapting to the ideal, quote, more communicative way of, teaching and enjoying the language rather than just not speaking and focusing on grammar. So
Helen,
Yeah.
did you grow up, did you learn English in Japan?
no, I was born and raised in the US. So
Okay.
yes.
Okay. Yanela?
What's funny,
No,
just one
Yanela,
last
did you have your
comment.
hand up? Sorry.
Oh.
Yanela, did you want to say something?
No.
Sorry. Yes, Steve?
Yeah, just one other thing that's quite funny is that the grammar translation method is exciting and effective and clear to about 10% of the students in a class, and they all become English teachers in the future. And so it's this
It's
self-perpetuating.
self-perpetuating.
Yeah, it's
I
just
remember
hilarious. Yeah.
My first visit to Japan, I asked to go and see an English lesson, and it was at a boys' high school in Tokyo, and it was a lesson on reading comprehension, I think. And I didn't understand any of it because it was all in Japanese,
Oh, yes.
or
There was a
90%
lot
of it
of-
was in
yeah.
Japanese.
There was a lot of teaching about English.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And
Anyway.
context is everything. I mean, I say this to my students every class. Context is everything.
Yeah.
And especially, for example, in an elite academic high school in a rural area where the students are pressured to go to the elite universities, they're at a great disadvantage because for the most part, the richer folks who can afford private tutors and better cram schools are in the big cities, and they're going to get into the prestige universities, but the pressure's extreme.
Yeah.
I mean, my girlfriend is a high school English teacher, and she's working 7 a.m. until 9:30 at night every day of the week. And I, ran into a mutual friend, and oh, how's Now doing? I said, well, she looks half dead most of the time, to be honest. They're trying to kill her. It's really sad.
Yeah, so I mean, bottom line, the name of the game is somehow to combine communicative, fun teaching of English together with some, most of this session I've been saying, yes, there is a place for explicit teaching, but not only. And what was happening in Japan until very recently has been virtually only, or 90% of the teaching has been explicit, explaining about it, as you said, explaining about the language rather than languaging, in fact. And the bottom line is that we need to find a balance so that students are not completely turned off by English, but there is some attempt to get them to express themselves and enjoy and like doing things in English at the same time as maintaining a measure of accuracy in their output. And it's okay, so who said it was easy? Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to stop here. I've got a couple more topics, but I'll go straight into the beginning of the next session, okay? And next session also, we're talking about teacher research. And I've got a couple of presentations, Michelle and who's the other one who's going to
I'm on
present?
the schedule for next week, yes?
Hugh, yes,
Yeah.
and
I'm assuming very informally, just because it is term
Yes,
end
very
for me and I'm
informally.
really busy. So I'm just
Very
going to be
informally.
speaking without formally preparing anything. I don't
No,
have time to, I'm afraid.
no, that's fine. If you want to, prepare a PowerPoint to share with us, that's fine. If you don't want to, that it's fine just to talk. Okay, but I'm just interested in hearing, and I'll also share my own experience of doing research as a teacher, not a professional researcher.
To be honest with you,
so-
it'll depend entirely on how this week goes with my class and with my class is one of my 5 jobs, so it'll depend on all the rest of my juggling, whether I have time to do it or not.
Okay. So you might not be able to do it next week? you
Oh,
say?
no, I can definitely speak to something. It's
Yeah.
just whether or not I can do a PowerPoint and get organized enough to take a
Right, okay.
look at the
Well-
explicit data, right? I may be able to
Yeah.
just represent more generally.
Okay, fine. That's
Okay.
great. Okay, so for once, we're finishing on time, would you believe? Okay, so Steve, you can turn off the recording. And so the